Riley, you did the same because I'm trying to juggle like 5 different things at once. So we'll be recording from this point forward. Riley, I would not have been LMAO. I would have been more like sad face emoji and then tears afterwards because I'm trying to be the AV team as well as trying to do this. So anyway, tomorrow, have this video worksheet done. Are there any questions that you guys had, though, about the previous video worksheet that you need me to address? Good, good. I'll be keeping an eye on that chat to make sure. If you've not been able to upload that to Schoology, try throughout the course of the day. I typically find that when we get to the evening time, when the usage goes down, we're about an hour behind the East Coast, obviously, with the time zones. And I find that as soon as schools start dipping into Schoology, their servers get taxed and they start to struggle quite a bit. So if you can't turn it in during the course of the day, do it in the nighttime. The deadline has to be flexible because of what our technology is doing. I'm not worried about a thing. So today we're going to be taking a look at then is we're going to be taking a look at period 2. While you're taking care of your content knowledge outside of our meetings, we'll be taking a look at your review materials. And when we take a look at period 2, this is the period that we emphasize quite heavily when we started teaching. This is 1607, 1754. This is Jamestown, going up until the start of the French and Indian War. And I apologize. What I've typically done in the past is I've been good about laying out for you what chapters this is including. And I didn't have that ready for today. And so this is going to be chapters 2 through 6, at least part of chapter 6. And then chapter 6 kind of bleeds into period 3 as well. So if you are looking for your materials, have your textbook handy, have your notes handy, and we should be good. Jada, you tried to turn your video worksheet and turn it in, it's still not working. I've got, let me bring you over to here, and I think it might be a Schoology issue because Schoology has been all sorts of messy all throughout the day. You can see that I've got submissions going on for each of the class periods. So during not quite so busy times, I think that the program is working better. So like I mentioned, don't worry about the deadline. Keep buzzing back, not consistently, but sometime during the course of the day, give this a try. And if you find towards the end of the day it's still giving you trouble, just get back in touch with me. I'll be able to help you out. So what I want you to think about when we're taking a look at period 2 is we want to be thinking about the type of essay questions that you could be asked. Tonight we're having a session. So I just got signed up for a session from the College Board. Let me bring you back to here. So we are scheduled to do a 6 p.m. webinar where every AP teacher in the country has been invited to a session to get details from the College Board as far as what the AP test is going to look like. I'll be able to get you many more details tomorrow about the specific elements of what our review needs to be. I can guarantee, though, that period 2 will be a topic that needs to be covered for the test. The question is just what sort of format will they be using to assess us? And once we get that information, we should be golden because I would anticipate that the testing dates will have some flexibility to them. And we've got plenty of time to work on review, especially if I'm able to flip content to you guys for stuff that we need to still cover. But our focus really right now should be on getting you guys started with your review process and into a good place. So when we take a look at period 2, 1607, 1754, we want to be thinking about, first of all, your context. And so contextualization is very much something that you should be thinking about. And it's something that will very much be a possibility when you're doing short answer essay sets. So thinking about, first of all, what was the previous time period like and what trends or movements were going on that then influences the time period that we're about to move into. You have just studied the time period of exploration, Spanish colonization, the encomienda system, and all of these things could be used as contextualizations. You could also talk about what's going on back in Europe during this time period. And as you see down here, it says, explain the context for the colonization of North America. They're going to do this for you. So over on the right-hand side, like I mentioned, this is where they actually tell you how your essay should be written on the AP test if you're good. You'll need to elaborate, and like we talked about yesterday with short answer essay questions, you do need to identify a proper noun And there's going to be a few of them that work. So when it's Spanish, French, Dutch, and British colonizers had different economic and imperial goals, understanding that the British are embracing an idea called mercantilism, the idea that the colonies are set up to try to create wealth for the new world, for the old world, while the Spanish are embracing the encomienda system, trying to utilize the 3 Gs for settlement. And we're going to find that these different colonies develop differently along the eastern coast with regional differences. This is setting up a compare-contrast question. So what I would do in the margin is I would make sure that in your studying, you are preparing for how are the Spanish and the French and the British colonies different from one another. The Portuguese are people who get aced out by the Treaty of Tordesillas. So they're involved in Brazil, which is world history, not US. You do have the Dutch in New York who are around for a bit, but I wouldn't anticipate a major essay question about them. But what I do want to highlight for you in the new style guide that I gave you right here is whenever you're wrestling with these questions, go back to your course themes. And what I want to be thinking about is look down this list and think to yourself, are there elements that I see here that they might be dealing with in the textbook? And the thing that's really hard to teach at the beginning of the course, but I'm hoping you're now seeing currently, is each time I've taught you stuff in class, it's related to something else. In a regular US history survey textbook, they can't give you a lot of trivia because otherwise the textbook would be gigantic, and it's already gigantic. And so if I double back to the video worksheet that we've got right here, my hope is that you can kind of see what I was setting you up for when in December, we were talking about these moments and we played like the sharecropping game. I wanted you to be prepared so that you could see at this time, 100 years later, Lyndon Johnson finds a country that still has poll taxes, literacy tests, Jim Crow laws, housing segregation, sharecropping. He goes in the Deep South and he finds people still living a century later as if it was the 1860s and not the 1960s. So that's really the thing that we want you to understand, is that in your history course, there are threads that we want you to be able to see. And when you notice them, that's where your essays are going to come from, is running along that thread of civil rights. Can you understand how Booker T. Washington could be compared to like a Martin Luther King, or how the actions of Reconstruction in the 1860s could be compared to what we call the second Reconstruction era in the 1950s and 1960s. So when we think about period 2, what I laid out for you at the beginning of our course is that period 2, our colonization period, does help us set up the idea of American and national identity. You learned about John Winthrop and his vision of us being a city on a hill, and that idea resonates throughout our entire course, where that does turn into American nationalism and the idea that with manifest destiny or imperialism, the Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine, keeping the world safe from communism, all of that weaves into the idea that as Americans, we come up with a philosophy of what does citizenship mean? What's the Constitution about? What is our American values and ideals? And so we want to be identifying elements of period 2 and each other period that helps us flesh this out. You see in period 2, work, exchange, and technology. The North develops their own economic system that's different than the South, and it helps plant the seeds in the 1600s for what will be the Civil War in the 1860s. For geography of the environment, we want to understand how do human beings impact the environment, but also how does the environment shape us, like you learned about in human geography. This chapter also is totally about migration and settlement, inward migration with push-pull factors coming from Europe, the impact that happens with internal migration as people land on the coast, move internally, and then butt up against Native American groups that are already living in the area. We're looking at political structures where we're going to remember during this time period, your main group that you want to notice in this period packet is Chesapeake and New England. And remember, the Chesapeake, they created this idea of legislative representation that's happening during a period of salutary neglect, which is another contextualization. America and the world, when it comes to foreign policy in this early time period, this is interaction with other trading partners, but also interaction with Native Americans who are not seen as truly American by Europeans who are English in background. We want to notice the regional culture that's happening, where we're finding that North and South, that sectionalism of the 1800s has its birth right here. And our social structures, the fact that in the Chesapeake with indentured servitude, you have a different working structure and class system compared to what's happening in the North during this time period. So as we double back to your period packet, what I'd like to highlight for you then, this contextualization piece, they're laying out for you is specifically how you should contextualize the time period. You should be putting proper nouns over on the right-hand side for you to be able to use to be specific about what context they're looking at for the time. But what we're going to be taking a look at today is we'll just take a look at each of the topics that you have here. Again, your chat space over on the right-hand side is available for you to post. Let me see here in the concept outlines. Sorry, Sophia, I wasn't checking my chat. In the concept outlines under the preview, Unit 2 concepts, there are little boxes with Casey on. All right, so let me double back to concept outlines under the preview. You're watching me flounder right now because I'm trying to see where you were referring to. And Sophia, if you want to unmute, you can if you wanted to clarify what. Oh, I see what you're talking about. So this is when you see KC, and Sophia, you got me. Perfect. KC means just key concepts. And so this is the code that they're going to be using. And in particular, the reason why they're using this is because they've got other areas, especially when I'm going on to AP Classroom. This is much more important for me because when it comes time for me to build stuff out for you on AP Classroom, I can just punch in that code and then it will give me certain question sets that specifically just addresses that key concept. And so we should be able to help you to get the materials you need. For yourself, though, it's not going to be vitally important to have that pinned down. I'm really glad you asked about that. And Sophia, thanks for helping out. So let's take a look, first of all, at European colonization. They're telling you a thematic focus that you could use to think about this material. Do not get confused about this where you start thinking to yourself that this will be definitively the theme that they could be exploring in this essay, in this content area. This is just a suggestion for you and I to think about that this is a big time where migration and settlement is taking place. There are other themes, though, that might also apply to this content. So any theme is fair game, even though they specifically peg one up here. Notice your question, though, explain how and why various European colonies developed and expanded from 1607 until 1754. So on your right-hand side, this is the page that will help you to understand the big groups that they want to be good with. You need to know about Spanish colonies. The French and the Dutch, they link together because both are here for trade. The Dutch in New York, the French along the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, and they're engaged in trading efforts and they're friendly with the Native Americans. And then the British have a very much diversified reason for colonization. Some are here for religion, some are here for profit. And these different colonial structures are going to be what we really want to focus on because of the fact that that's going to be the primary foundation for our course. So making sure that you feel good about these, and in particular, they tell you what the answer of your question should be. If they're asking you to think about the various causes for English colonization, they're right here. They're looking for social mobility, economic prosperity, religious freedom, improving living conditions. And this is how you should really think about your review process. Do you have examples of this? You know, the terms that could be off on the right-hand side could be John Winthrop and the Great Puritan Migration of 1630. You could talk about the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth. You could talk about Jamestown and Starving Time with John Smith, where they were looking to make money over here. That's your key, though, is just announcing these things doesn't make you look special. It's that use of a proper noun to be able to then prove that this was taking place rather than just parroting what the College Board says. They want you to provide support with evidence that you are actually understanding what's going on here. Our class obviously is focused on the regions of British colonization. And so it's mentioning here how geography and the environment is going to impact the North and the South, which you're already aware of. So you already know about why in the Chesapeake and South, You had a plantation style system. Their climate is warmer. They don't have the same rocky soil that they've got up in New England. They're able to create large plantations along the waterways. And so it asks you to think about how and why environmental and other factors shaped the development and expansion of various British colonies that developed and expanded from 1607 to 1754. So what I would like you to do, please, I'm just going to scan up like this. I want you to take a sheet of notebook paper, and what I'd like you to quickly do is I would like you to analyze the geographic and other factors that led to the creation of the Chesapeake and New England colonies. Now, this is something I'm just going to have you do for about 2 minutes just to see how good you are. If you want to cheat, you definitely can look down this list. But what we're trying to figure out right now is how good are you? Do you need to review this time period a lot, or do you not need to review a lot? And what questions might you have? So take about 2 minutes. I'll sip my coffee while you're working. But check to see how good you are with Chesapeake and New England, which we focused on early in the year, but you may not be super solid with still. As you're working, also think about the fact that this question is not asking you just to think about uh, what started the colony. So don't just get stuck on starving time and the city on a hill. It's asking you about their establishment and expansion to 1754. So test yourself. Do you remember things that caused changes in the late 1600s, early 1700s that caused the colonies to become different from one another? All right. So you've had a little bit of time to get your juices flowing. You should figure out at this point if you need anything retaught, but let me give you just a quick synopsis. And this is something that I want to highlight for all of you guys. I have kids who tell me when they come back to school the following year, as 11th graders, they'll be like, "Oh, Hohenstein, I forgot everything that we learned way back when." And after like 5 minutes of talking to those kids, they'll get everything back in a heartbeat. It's the way that your brain works. Your brain cannot have everything in your immediate knowledge that is constantly in the front of your brain, because then you would be overwhelmed. It's kind of like my computer right now, living with like 20 tabs open. It's struggling right now because I've got way too much stuff that it's trying to pay attention to. But you've got that knowledge locked in your brain. So when I remind you of these things, most likely you'll have these moments where you're like, "Oh yeah, that neuron's waiting to be fired." We do need to rehearse it though. So if you find that this is one of your weaker time periods, most kids feel the same. So instead, what you should do, think about study guide, flashcards, reviewing your notes. Find your tough spots, make sure you're good with them. But for the Chesapeake, over on the right-hand side, here are the things that I would want you to be good with. Remember starving time, where this was a joint stock colony that was built by investors over in England to try to make a profit. They're looking for gold. You learn about John Smith, who had to impose really strict policies because people were starving, because they're south of the Mason-Dixon line. So remember, being able to talk about not just how it was a warm climate, it's south of the Mason-Dixon line, which means they're dealing with yellow fever and other sorts of plague-like conditions that are killing many people. Half the period people are getting sick. And again, when we double back to the idea of what are we experiencing with coronavirus, you have people who are now encountering a disease for the first time from a tropical environment, and it's causing a lot of struggles. The Native Americans nearby, the Powhatans, are watching what's going on, and they actually allow Jamestown to survive because of the fact that they like trading with them. But then many of the diseases like smallpox that the British bring are going to the Native Americans and weakening them. So as time goes forward, Jamestown will grow, especially with John Rolfe and the introduction of tobacco, while Native Americans are going to struggle. Many of the white settlers are going to then start attacking Native American food supplies, forcing them further back into the Appalachian Mountains. And in particular, remember, we talked about how these guys are settling along rivers so they can transport stuff down to market on flatboats. And so to have a plantation, you don't want to be in the back country away from water, because then you're going to end up being like poor white trash and you're not going to be able to actually make a profit. We do bring indentured servants to America, but that's going to largely come to an end with the most delicious rebellion ever in US history, Bacon's Rebellion, that is going to convince many people in the Chesapeake that it is not worth the time to bring in poor white people to work temporarily. They should instead find workers who can work for their lifetimes, who have been exposed to malaria and other sorts of diseases. And that's where we see the replacement of indentured servants by African Americans. When you think about these guys, then they realize that they are so distant from the home country, and they've got threats. They're threatened by the Spanish. They're threatened by the Native Americans. They're threatened by their own white laborers. They create the House of Burgesses, which creates our legislative branch in that colony to try to keep them organized and get stuff done. We've now taken you from 1607 to 1754 then, and what you'll want to notice is most of your competition is going to stay in 1607. So if you get an essay question like this, many kids will write down, oh my goodness, they had starving time, then they introduced tobacco, then they added slaves. It wasn't like immediate like that. And most kids can't use proper nouns, which is totally what the College Board is looking for. So if you start writing an essay where it's like, oh, and then the indentured servants were mad and they started using slaves, and it's all fluffy generalities without specifics, you're not impressing anybody. Even though you'll be factually accurate, the College Board is going to argue that you should take this class again to see if you can actually start bringing in specific facts that can actually impress a reader. So that proper noun piece is something I can't accentuate enough. Down here with the New England colonies, remember, we had these people in England who were Protestants, but they weren't the Protestant faith that was embraced by England. So when you look at the Chesapeake, they're Anglicans. They're the Church of England. They are in good with Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and so on. The dominant church in England, when they break from the Catholic Church, they're part of it. The New England colonies, though, are filled with people who are Calvinists. And so you remember, we started the class by talking about John Calvin, and he was a guy who was a Protestant who believed that the Bible, literally as it's written, is how the Bible should be interpreted. So if it says that the entire world flooded and Noah built an ark, then that's totally what happened. The story of Jonah, where he gets swallowed by a gigantic fish, and he lives in the belly of the fish for a long time until the fish barfs him out. They're like, it's there. God says so. And what they believe is that they believe in predestination. God knows who's going to heaven or hell before you're ever born. And it's not about you working your way into heaven. It's about identifying who the chosen are. And the chosen are the ones who are being successful in every aspect of their life. They're economically prosperous, they're morally good, and they're coming to America to escape Anglican faith to try to create their own city on a hill here during the Great Puritan Migration. In this colony, then, you have congregationalism. So when we talked about that, each congregation or each church makes up their own rules. They're governing themselves. They're not quite a theocracy, which means that it's a government run by the religious leaders. But in order to get elected, you must be somebody who is in good standing with the church. So they're really close to being a theocracy. Unlike the Chesapeake, where they're growing tobacco, you have small farms because they've got rocky soil, but they are farming. They're also fishing. They're cutting down lumber. They're shipbuilding. They're trading. They've got a diverse economy. They also have slaves, but the slave is usually somebody who is like an apprentice for the local minister to help him do the day-to-day chores that he needs to have done so he can go do his ministry work. So when it's time to get rid of slavery, for New England, it's not as hard as for the South because their slaves become just the lowest class of workers. They're technically not slaves anymore, but it's not like they're enjoying equality. It is rare to get an essay question that is not Chesapeake and New England in focus. The middle colonies like New York and Pennsylvania, these colonies, if you remember, they were established at different times. Pennsylvania as a haven for Quakers, New York as a economic base for the Dutch, a along the Hudson River. And what's going to happen is these colonies become known as our bread colonies. They're the ones who are producing a lot of wheat and other sorts of grains and other sorts of foodstuffs that they can then give to the other colonies in trade. And then they can trade with New England to get fish or lumber. They can trade with the Chesapeake for tobacco. Rice and indigo is coming from the Carolinas up here, still plantation based. But we're going to find that in the Southern Atlantic and the West Indies, what I'd like you to remember with this bottom prompt down here is, remember when South Carolina got opened for colonization, they couldn't find British people who wanted to go there because they'd already heard about like smallpox, and sorry, not smallpox, yellow fever and malaria. And so the people who didn't want to come were British people in other part of the colonies. You had poor white indentured servants moving to North Carolina. But in South Carolina, you had people moving from Barbados. And that's what I would put over in the side over here with the Barbados slave codes. You had Barbados planters. Primogeniture was taking place. So the kids who were the sons of planters start building plantations here. And so you have plantation structure in the South, diverse economy in the North, which is totally what you guys saw then throughout the entire rest of the course from October until December, building up our sectionalism. You'll notice the way that our concept outline works. So as you're reviewing this over the next couple of weeks, notice that the College Board will lead you right up to the moment where they talk about how Britain's lax attention to the colonies created self-governing institutions. New England had town meetings. The South had their elected assemblies. Notice how they don't give you the proper noun. They're waiting for you to include it. The lax attention from the British, that's known as salutary neglect. The legislature in the South, that is the House of Burgesses. So there is some work for you to do, but the College Board is writing like 95% of your essay. They're just looking for you to provide the proper noun to explore it a little bit further to show that you know enough that you can then bypass college US history in your first year. When we look at the transatlantic trade then, notice how they're setting up your essay questions. So you should verbally be able to play with this with your friends. And this is something you can easily use with Google Meet or FaceTime or whatever, just getting on with a friend and trying to articulate in your own words, what were the causes of the transatlantic trade? What were the effects of transatlantic trade? Can you explain that to your friends to be able to explain what's going on with the English element of the Columbian Exchange? If I could double back here for just a second, though, what I do want to highlight for you is remember that this is asking for 1607 to 1754, environmental and other factors. I do want to remind you of a couple elements that should be over here for New England that really made them different. Number one, remember the halfway covenant, where you had Puritans in the late 1600s who tried to create a funky rule where they tried to tell kids your age that because they never had a conversion experience, they couldn't be true Puritans. But then many people my age started dying, and they're like, oh my goodness, our faith is about to die out. They try to gateway in kids so that they're able to be part of the church. The church, though, starts to malfunction because you have immigrants that start moving into New England who are not Puritans. They're just there to trade in Boston and other places. So remember, you see tension rising religiously, especially with conservatives who wanted to hold on to their old church functions. And you see that with the Salem witch trials. So in Salem in the 1690s, they actually start killing people that they suspect of being different or bad. If you're looking for any light reading while you guys are out on break, and I don't mean light reading realistically, I mean kind of a joking style, you have two different books that if you wanted to dive into, you could understand them to see how the Puritans become a metaphor for intolerance. If you ever want to read The Scarlet Letter, if you haven't read it yet, it's a representation of how intolerant reformers can be. And this is written in the 1800s during the Second Great Awakening. But this is meant to use the Puritans as a symbol that while they're religiously trying to be good, they are able to do horrifically bad things to try to punish people they suspect of being adulterers. Also notice the book, The Crucible by Arthur Miller, much more readable from the 1950s. Arthur Miller was accused of being a communist. And so when he was trying to describe McCarthyism of the 1950s, he used the example of the Puritans of the 1600s. So if people were like, oh, you're a communist, you're writing about what's going on now. He's like, no, I'm writing about Puritans and how intolerant they are, but it's totally a metaphor for what McCarthy was up to in the 1950s with his communist witch hunts. What we also want to notice, though, with the New England colonies is please remember the First Great Awakening. And that's where I really want you guys to be able to dive into, where you have a division of the church into old and new lights. And that division is going to then lead to a splitting of the Puritan church, the loss of power that they have to kind of really restrain people's behavior. And that freedom is going to give people independence to start questioning and challenging, exploring science with the Enlightenment. And this is eventually going to help lead us towards the revolution, where you have many more free thinkers in the city on a hill in Boston that becomes the haven for our revolution. So as we scan down here to the transatlantic trade, I don't typically find that there are kids who are really confused about what's going on with the causes of transatlantic trade. Mercantilism is what's going on here. The British set up the colonies to be the producers of raw materials, and then they're supposed to be buying finished products from England. This system is slanted, though. It's meant to drive the British colonies into debt so that the British themselves can leech all the money out of the colonies. That's what's making the colonists super mad. During the period of salutary neglect, though, you've got Americans who are starting to smuggle, and that's happening during the period of salutary neglect. But with mercantilism, what I would put off to the right-hand side over here, the British do start creating navigation acts, and that's the term that you want to use. The British will occasionally start enforcing laws against the colonists to try to force them to fall into line. Let me hear, Sophia, what was it called when the Puritans did something to get kids to believe in Puritanism so it wouldn't die out? That is your halfway covenant. And so that's the one where it was less about getting them to believe in Puritanism. It's more about relaxing the standards for what it takes to be a leader. So imagine if I rigged the system to make sure that 40-somethings stayed in power for the next 20 years, keeping power out of your hands. And then at the time of my death, I'm like, hey, by the way, you can join my club. Many kids were like, I don't want to join your club. You guys were the ones who shut us out forever. And by the way, you're still fighting a battle against English Anglicanism that we don't even have in Boston. And so they're not, it's old people trying to understand young people. So the halfway covenant is like the 1600s version of OK Boomer, where it's like, hey, you think what you're doing is super great, and most of the kids are not buying it. We want to notice the interactions between American Indians and Europeans, explain how and why interactions between various European nations and Indians changed over time. Notice the different country groups. So think about the French, Dutch, British, and Spanish, and what they were doing with the Native Americans. Spanish first, their encomienda system. They are enslaving Native Americans, but they're also intermarrying with them. They're trying to convert them to Catholicism, and that leads to a mixed race society. The French are trying to trade with the Native Americans, trying to get furs from them. And as a result, along the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, many Native Americans will ally with the French during the French and Indian War because they see them treating them much more fairly than the British have been treating the Native Americans along the eastern seaboard. With the British, there is trade that's taking place. So we do have some positives that are happening. But this trade is imbalanced. So the Native Americans are initially showing the British where furs are located, helping them to get supplies. The British will provide them with goods that are finished, like they're doing to the colonists with mercantilism, but they're not going to teach them how to make this equipment. And so eventually the Native Americans will become dependent. And then as people start moving outwards, they start moving into Native American territory, which leads to King Philip's War. Over on the right-hand side here, then, you should have other Native American conflicts too. So let me remind you of them. You had the Anglo-Powhatan War, the first and second one that happened in Virginia. That was the thing that eventually led to the destruction of the Powhatans and the driving of them further out west. You learned during this time period of the Pequot War also that happened up in New England. You've got King Philip's War that is located right here. Eventually, you're going to have groups in the 1740s and 50s who are known as the Paxton Boys, the Regulators. Bacon's Rebellion was mobilized around the idea of attacking Indians, the Powhatan, who were threatening them on the western frontier. The Spanish also are going to have problems because many Native Americans will resist the forcing of assimilation and the adoption of Catholicism. So you have the Pueblo Revolt, also known as Pope's Rebellion, that you learned about in your textbook. So again, with these, just saying that the Indians and the Europeans fought is not enough. You need proper nouns to prove what was taking place. When we think about slavery in the British colonies, explain the causes and effects of slavery in the various British colonies, keep in mind all colonies had slaves during this time period, but it was different in different areas. Not that it was somehow better to hold slavery, but the term chattel slavery is the idea of perpetual, lifelong abuse of slavery, where up in the North, slavery was much more like apprentices, workers who were working as house servants and whatnot. And the transition from slavery to something else was easier than what you had in the South. Keep in mind with this, I would put over into the margin what causes this, the headright system. And in the headright system, remember that during the first period of the Jamestown colony, if you brought over a worker from outside the colonies, you got 50 acres of land to add to your plantation. This is going to create a perverse incentive, though, to add more workers. And then when indentured servitude fails, we're going to find that this is going to lead to plantations that are gigantic that can't live without workers. And in particular, what I would put over in the margin over here, the only reason why people are buying American tobacco or eventually American cotton or rice or indigo isn't because the quality is so much better than everybody else's. We're just not paying our workforce, which makes the price of all of those products cheaper. If you notice that when you go to a place like Walmart, you can buy Chinese shoes for like 10 bucks, it's telling you how much they're paying their workers, and the answer is not much. And so you've got this labor system that's allowing people to sell for dirt cheap prices and still make a profit. And that's where our slavery system is going to come from. This is going to lead to also the embrace of the Barbados slave codes, because when you concentrate that many African Americans in one place, you have the potential for rebellions, uprisings. That's why you can't have freedom of movement, freedom to learn, freedom to read. And eventually, what starts happening is this strict Barbados slave element, the codes that they have, will become the slave codes that America adopts. You'll remember that we talked about African Americans and the way that they tried to respond to slavery. You had worker slowdowns, you had an embrace of Christianity to try to create unity. You had the embrace of extended families, where Native African Americans would start calling other people who weren't related auntie, uncles, cousins, even though they're not blood relations. Because remember, Native Americans could be beaten, they could be killed, they could be sold to other plantations. And so as a result, there's an attempt going on with African Americans to try to psychologically and physically survive this environment. When we think about what's going on with the culture and society of the colonies, says here, explain how and why the movement of a variety of people and ideas across the Atlantic contributed to the development of an American culture over time. Notice the movements that they're giving you. First Great Awakening right here, there's your proper noun. We need to then be able to talk about what this does. So the First Great Awakening is coming from the fact that you had, and I'd put this over on this side, you have the presence of different European religious and ethnic groups. On this side, you really should put down the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church wasn't super excited and isn't excited nowadays about really being open-minded to different ways of celebrating your faith. They're very much of the mindset that there's one way to do this, but you've now got Lutherans, you've now got Puritans, Calvinists, you've got Anglicans, and this is opening up a freedom of thinking that then leads to the First Great Awakening. In the First Great Awakening, the term that I would use is old and new lights. The old lights want to hold on to the old ways of the Puritan faith. The new lights want to think about different ways. They split the churches in half. You end up with groups like the Baptists, Presbyterians, and other sorts of groups that are going to come splintering off of this. And as a result, like if you hear somebody say that America's a Christian nation, that just means that we're a country that has a lot of people who see Jesus Christ as being divine. But when you get into the granular level, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean that a Catholic's going to get along with a Lutheran or a Presbyterian or whatever. And that is then going to open up America as an environment to start studying Enlightenment ideas. The idea that science and reason should be used instead of religion as ways to explain the universe. We talked about this with like Ben Franklin, a Renaissance man who's into everything, Washington and Jefferson, the rise of deism, where you've got some founding fathers who believe that there is a deity that's out there, but it's not like a Greek god sitting on a throne. Instead, this person organized and set up the universe, and it's our job to understand scientifically how the universe works. This is going to lead to the ideas of perhaps there's a perfect way of running society or our economy, moving away from mercantilism to capitalism, a way to run our government with like democracy and unalienable rights. The British colonies will become more British. So Anglicization is going to be the idea that we're adopting British norms and values. We speak English, and we practice many of the cultural traits that are there. But this is also going to be challenged and is going to face problems as you have waves of other immigrants coming in, like the Scots-Irish, like the Germans and others. But this becomes the foundation of our culture, with these different elements becoming foundational. Explain how and why the different goals and interests of European leaders and colonists affected how they viewed themselves and their relationship with Britain. When we think about the European leaders and colonists at this time, they were starting to grow away from one another. We're not revolutionary yet, but remember what we talked about. You've got people in the back country who are concerned about what's going on with territorial settlements, especially when we have all of those wars between England and France that could lead to expansion. But the British instead are focused on Europe and European competition. So after each of those wars that you learned about in your chapters before the French and Indian War, we would traditionally give back land to the French in return for concessions over in Europe. The idea of defense, remember that Bacon's rebellion was strictly about the idea that the indentured servants were super mad that they wanted the Indians removed as a threat because they would settle beyond the perimeter of defenses in Virginia. And many times the rich people on the coastline wouldn't do much to actually attack the Indians on their behalf. These colonists want self-rule. And remember, they talk about taxation with representation. And these colonists, if you think about where we are from 1607 to 1754, remember that you've got 140 years of the colonists governing themselves when we get to the French and Indian War. The American Civil War wrapped up in 1865. We're now in 2020. So we are just a little bit more distant from the Civil War than the colonists were during the French and Indian War from their origins. That's a really long time. And so the colonists get used to the idea of being independent. They have started embracing the Enlightenment. They are now religiously independent. They've got a diversity that's going on here. And there's a feeling that England is corrupt. Let me give you two different names that you guys should be familiar with. Remember the name John Locke? John Locke is the philosopher who is going to write that we are all endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that these are life, liberty, and property. And many of these people over in England who don't like the king, they're organizing themselves into what's known as the radical Whigs. So remember, when we get to Andrew Jackson's time, the Whigs are going to call themselves the Whigs because that was the party that resisted the king during that colonial time. As we scan down here, though, this is going to set the foundation for where our revolution is going to be coming from. We're not revolutionary yet, but Americans have fallen in love with salutary neglect. They have become capitalistic because they've been smuggling to other places around the world. And following the French and Indian War, you remember the king will put into place taxes and the proclamation line of 1763 to stop people from moving out west. So they give you a skill that you can play around with, where they give you an indicator of what could pop up as an essay question if they give you a compare contrast. Again, this is how you use this packet well. If you're still in the writing down proper nouns phase on the right-hand side, you're not doing anything bad. You've got plenty of time to work with. But you look at this, this is totally written like an essay question on the AP test would be. Compare the effects of the development of colonial society in the various regions of North America. They want you to be able to write this. And if you look at this, this is a fantastic thesis statement where they're talking about Europeans developed a variety of colonization migration patterns influenced by different imperial goals, cultures, and the varied North American environments where they settled, and they competed with each other and the American Indians for resources. So as we look at the Spanish, French, Dutch, and British, They do want to be able to compare and contrast their economic situation. French are here for furs, Spanish 3Gs, Dutch are trying to trade in in New York, and the British have a very diverse colonial structure with different economies. And that's going to shape their social and political development. In the Chesapeake, you end up with these gigantic landowners who have huge plantations along the rivers, and then a huge growing underclass of indentured servants that are being pushed either west into Indian Territory or into North Carolina. They build a house of burgesses to govern themselves. And that structure is going to be very different than what they have up in New England, where they're going to be engaged in town halls and city councils and ways to communicate with one another to make decisions for their local community. When we look at the British colonies, we do want to be able to explore these 4 different regions. And so this is what should be in your margins. You should be able to talk about New England and the Chesapeake primarily. You got to be able to compare and contrast those. And you need to be able to do it in these categories. Well, how's their environment different? How's their economy different? How's their culture and demographic factors different? So Chesapeake and New England, and then remember, middle and southern should also be in your consideration. This competition between European rivals and American Indians led to industry and trade. But think about the wars that we've talked about. You're going to have wars between England and France, multiple of them before we ever get to the big one with the French and Indian War. And the American Indians, you want to put the point over here, they're going to engage in what's called the middle ground. They're stuck in the Appalachian Mountain Trans-Mississippi area, and they're trying to play enemies against one another. Can I play England against France? Or down around like Georgia, can I play England against Spain? So they can work out a deal with either one. This only works, though, if there's different Europeans still in existence. So look forward in your notes, and remember, French and Indian War, the French are done after 1763. After the early 1800s, when Jackson invades Florida, the Spanish are done as a threat. We're also going to have the Louisiana Purchase in 1800s, where the French are removed. And once it's just American colonists facing Native Americans, the Native Americans will ally with the British in the War of 1812. But once that's done, you see an all-out campaign to push Native Americans further back in the period known as Manifest Destiny. As you look down here, the British colonies participated in political, social, cultural, and economic exchanges with Great Britain that encouraged both stronger bonds and resistance. So this trade that we have right here, here are the terms that belong on the right-hand side. Mercantilism. The colonists do benefit from mercantilism. I do not want to leave this site. Please do not make me leave. Okay, log that off. Goodbye. So mercantilism, don't focus just on the negative. For the colonists, they love the fact that the British Navy is protecting them as they go across the ocean, so that the Spanish and the French can't attack them easily. If they attack an American ship flying a British flag, they could then face an all-out war. There's religious exchanges going on where we've got information going back and forth across the ocean during the Great Awakening. You've also got philosophical exchanges taking place when it comes to the Enlightenment, and political exchanges, especially with the writings of John Locke. And so you have Americans who feel like they're doing well. And in particular, the name that you could put over here is Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was convinced at the start of the French and Indian War that we were on the verge of building a British empire that would last forever with America and Britain united. He just said, look, England is an island. It's tiny. America is going to be gigantic. So in Ben Franklin's mind, we're going to stay united, but the center of the British Empire will become America, and the capital of England will move from London to the United States. You especially see that, and this should go over on the side over here, with his Albany Congress. He holds a meeting where he's like, why don't we just give some self-government to the colonists? The British can be part of this too. We'll defend ourselves against Indians. And what the British say is, we don't want to give up control, not understanding they've already given up control during the period of salutary neglect. The colonists reject the Albany Congress because they're like, if we create a central government here, we won't have the freedom that we have with the British being hundreds of miles away. But we're going to find we are engaged in the slave trade. We do develop a system of slavery. that is characterized like places in Barbados. And this then leads us into a period with the French and Indian War where this could be the moment that America and Britain unites. But instead, when the French are taken away as a threat, America is now going to want to go back to salutary neglect. And the king desperately needs cash from taxes. He's going to try to impose control with the Proclamation Line of 1763, strict enforcement of the Navigation Acts, and that's going to lead us towards a revolution. So I'm going to turn on my chat one more time to take a look, but hopefully this stuff is resonating with you. And the thing that I would encourage you to keep in mind, none of this stuff should scare you. So if you look at any of the concepts that we just reviewed today and you're like, holy cow, I mean, this is like barely a memory for me. Cool. Bust out flashcards, take out your notes, take out your study guide, do something like that. Go back to your Gilder-Lehrman site. So let me remind you of some links that I shared with you. If I go back up to here, this Gilder-Lehrman site that I have here will give you a video overview of the time period. So if you're like, man, none of that stuff really seemed familiar, go back and watch this. Go back to your Schoology page and find the folders for chapters 2 through 6. All of the crash courses that are relevant for the time period are located there. But then also let me into the conversation. If you find any of these concepts, you're like, hey, you were moving too fast. I didn't want to post my questions off to the side. And by the way, for those of you who are either asking questions to me or you're acting as a super team helping one another, I am so impressed by you guys. It's one of the many reasons why I hate this style of teaching, because being away from you physically and not being able to see this happen in my classroom is something that's really depressing to me, but it's cool to see you doing it electronically. If you don't want to do it publicly, though, and you want me just one-on-one with you, feel free to shoot me an email. Schoology is not something that is working great, but my email is working just fine. We can set up a FaceTime for us to be able to meet in a Google Meet or whatever, and I can help you out in whatever ways you want. The recording of this is going to be available for you also in just a little bit. So what'll happen is once I get done, it takes some time to process, then I'll upload it onto YouTube, and then I'll be able to make it available for you. And again, I wouldn't trust Schoology. I am trying to dump stuff here in my Schoology folder. It's not behaving nicely, so I will put your recordings here. Oh, shoot, I forgot to switch over to my screen again. I will put your videos into the Schoology folder titled Google Meet Meetings, but I will also just copy and paste into this document right here, right into this space, Google Meet recording. I'll put in there the YouTube recording link. So hopefully the hot links that I'm providing for you guys are keeping you safe. So for tomorrow, have this video worksheet done. If you can't submit easily, wait for a time that you can. We'll discuss tomorrow what was happening with the civil rights movement through the JFK presidency. And then tomorrow I'm going to introduce, oh my goodness, introduce a portion of period 3 to you. We'll be doing tomorrow the path to the revolution itself. And then next week, we'll start diving into Articles of Confederation versus Constitution, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. But in particular, I don't want to go much further than the beginning of period 3, again, because of what's supposed to be happening tonight. So tomorrow at the beginning, I will lay out for you exactly what the parameters of our AP tests are. And it will tell us how much work we need to be worried about adding in additionally on top of all of the great stuff you've already done. So you guys have already done tons of practice with multiple choice tests, short answer essays. You've played around with long answers. You've had a chance to look at DBQs. And so in my mind, I'm not nervous. If you are, you should also let me in as well, because if you are feeling stressed because of the weird dynamics we have from being distance learning, that's totally appropriate to feel. Just let me in so I can help you out. I don't see any of the questions in the chat, so I'm going to end the recording now. But again, hopefully things are going well with you. If you are experiencing any technology issues, do not get nervous about your grade. The district is still trying to figure out what we're even doing with your grading, with the understanding that we may be out for a long period of time. President Trump yesterday went from not being super worried about coronavirus, we were going to be back by Easter. He's now talking about if we do everything right over the next couple months, we could see 250,000 people pass away in our country, which would be more than most of our 20th century wars added together as a casualty rate. That's not insignificant. And so I anticipate we'll be out for a while. And then we're waiting for guidance from the district as far as what your grading will look like. So if you run into a glitch with technology, you're doing just fine. Just let me in and I'll be able to be really soft with that deadline. I don't see any more questions. Thanks for joining me this morning. I miss you guys. Hopefully you're doing good. I will see you tomorrow at 8.